This content should not be construed as financial or investment advice. I am simply sharing my personal views and perspectives, which I hope will educate and inform and help give you the confidence to make your own financial decisions. If you need financial investment advice, please seek in-person advice from a qualified, experienced, and regulated finance professional. YouTube will not save you.
Hello, so I'm the Fourth Accountant, and today we're going to be checking out this video by TLDR News, which is a great channel, and as usual I'll leave a link to this original video discussing whether or not Andy Burnham, the new Prime Minister of the UK, is left-leaning or surprisingly right-leaning. So the thing about Andy Burnham is he's been a politician for quite some time. He did step away from the House of Commons and was basically the mayor of Manchester, or a region of Manchester, I can't remember which region, for quite some time, and grew in popularity over that time in terms of how he's been managing things in that region and how he dealt with some of the issues that happened in Manchester. And in particular, I believe there was a terrorist attack at an Ariana Grande concert, if I remember correctly. And again, the way he handled that situation basically meant that many people sort of leaned towards him, got behind him, and he grew in popularity basically, so that when Keir Starmer came under pressure, that was the previous Prime Minister, as and when Andy Burnham was able to find a path back into politics via the by-election, then it just meant that ultimately Keir Starmer's position basically became untenable, and he had to then resign. And then it was fairly straightforward in terms of how quickly Andy Burnham came into power. So based on a lot of the things that Andy Burnham has said in the past, the underlying view was that he would be more left-leaning relative to someone like Keir Starmer. However, as I say, we don't really know much about Andy Burnham, honestly, and I think it's now going to be interesting to see what kind of policies he has in mind. So he has from the outset said he wants to end homelessness and rough sleeping, which would be more of a less left-leaning position. But some of his cabinet appointments clearly signal right-leaning policies, such as keeping the current Home Secretary, I think it's Shamima Mahmood, if I pronounced that correctly, in post, who has pushed a very anti-immigrant agenda and policies. So on the one hand, he's saying certain things and doing certain things that appear to be left-leaning, but on the other hand, some of his appointments would suggest he's sticking to some of the right-leaning mandates of Keir Starmer's Labour government. And also it remains unclear at this point in time what his tax policy and his economic policy will look like, essentially. So I think this video will be quite interesting to see what further speculation there is regarding Andy Burnham and what he might do. So let's dive in and see what we can learn.
A Blairite, a Brownite, and a Corbynite walk into a bar. The barman says, "What'll you have, Andy?" Well, not particularly funny. This joke has done the rounds in Whitehall circles for a number of years, with those telling it attempting to highlight Burnham's seemingly inconsistent ideological positioning. As Prime Minister, there seems to be an assumption that Burnham will govern as a left-winger. Already, he's spoken about Britain taking some wrong turns in the 1980s under Margaret.
Yeah, and that's true, as I say, like based on the things he's said, there is this assumption he will be left-leaning. But as I say, some of the things he's doing seem to contradict that.
Margaret Thatcher. He's introduced new cost of living support, and he's pledged to end rough sleeping. However, there is also evidence of Burnham actually moving to the right somewhat, with key government positions being occupied by those on the right of the Labour Party, and suggestions that Burnham could cut government spending in certain places, for instance on welfare.
Yeah, so in that clip there, the Chancellor, the new Chancellor, I believe, was the Defence Secretary, the previous Defence Secretary, who resigned under Keir Starmer because his belief was that there was not enough spending on the military, right? So clearly that's a more right-leaning position. And if you're putting someone in charge of the national purse who believes there needs to be more military spending, you can kind of see why that would indicate a more hawkish position by somebody who is perceived to be left-leaning.
So we're going to have a look into this. Exactly what Burnham has done that suggests he's moving right.
This whole thing kind of looks like a green screen to me. I thought I just had to make that comment. Like, it doesn't look like a real background. I know this actually happened when he became a leader of the Labour Party, but the image actually does look like he's standing in front of a green screen.
And whether it's fair to characterize Andy Burnham as a leader that is pivoting to the right. Now, when Burnham became Prime Minister last week, one of his first tasks was to form a cabinet. For weeks, there had been frenzied speculation about exactly what positions certain politicians would be given, notably allies such as Ed Miliband and Lisa Nandy. However, one of the most spoken about potential cabinet members was Shabana Mahmood, someone particularly controversial in Labour circles as a result of her immigration reforms. As Home Secretary under Keir Starmer, Mahmood introduced the Asylum and Immigration Bill, which will increase the forced removal of people refused asylum, tightens definitions under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights, or ECHR, to limit its use in asylum cases, and creates a new tribunal for immigration and human rights appeals, which will be used before cases are sent to judges. Mahmood has also pushed forward new changes to indefinite leave to remain, suggesting that the time taken to qualify should increase from 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, and a lot of these changes were just, I think, personally, in response to pressure from the right. And this is why it's being characterized as a right-leaning position, because many of the points, parties like the Reform Party and the Conservative Party have been making, is that, we've had this sort of overwhelming influx of immigrants, and they are taking jobs and they are taking homes away, and they're creating pressure on public and social infrastructure. And it has been gaining traction simply because obviously they've been taking a lot of votes. And clearly that's been reflected, certainly from Reform's perspective, in the recent UK elections, where they did really, really well and they grabbed a lot of seats. So there is this sentiment and view that we are, as a public, losing patience with immigrants. And I think Labour have felt the need to respond to that by being very, very tough and regressive in terms of some of the changes they've made with respect to right to remain, for example. So I think for me, it's an interesting approach, because I think for me, it's only a symptom of a more deeper problem. But I think the other issue actually is that it may mean, and it might be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you view this, many immigrants will not want to come to the UK to work. But also what that will mean ultimately is that you've got less workers paying tax, because a lot of these immigrants, despite the fact they don't have rights to remain, will still be tax-paying workers and contributing to basically offsetting the national deficit that still exists, I believe. So I think it's going to be interesting to see medium and long term how this policy pans out.
In addition to these changes, Mahmood further frustrated those on the left of the party for her suggestion, again back when she was Home Secretary under Starmer, that AI could play more of a role in combating crime. Mahmood announced in January that the government plans to increase the number of facial recognition bans from 10 to 50, and in an interview with Tony Blair, explained that she wanted to achieve, by means of AI and technology, what Jeremy Bentham tried to do with the Panopticon. For obvious reasons, these proposed changes frustrated those on the left, who didn't want to see Mahmood anywhere near Burnham's new government. Despite this, there was some speculation that Mahmood could potentially be given one of the great offices of state, potentially even the role of Chancellor. In the end, Mahmood was reappointed to her role of Home Secretary. This was the first sign that Burnham's government was moving to the right. The other signs came largely from his statements on policy. Now, one of the big rebellions that severely damaged Keir Starmer's authority were his plans to cut the UK's welfare bill. Keir Starmer had originally planned to narrow the eligibility for personal independence payments, or PIP, and to introduce restrictions on universal credit. However, facing a major backbench rebellion orchestrated by those on the left of the party, he was forced to back down on these changes. Burnham, though, seems keen to succeed where Starmer has failed, with him reportedly plotting to crack down on youth sickness benefits in order to pay for social care and defence.
Yeah, it's interesting that, again, as I say, spend on defence has apparently he's looking to increase that, right? And it makes sense in terms of his appointment to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, right? So that ties together. And what I would say actually is that in many ways, Andy Burnham, I think, is like many of us actually, where he will be right leaning on some things and left leaning on other things. And I think there's this danger, certainly in the media, because it's easier, right? It's simplistic to say, okay, this is a right leaning individual and this is a left leaning individual. To me, it makes more sense to talk about a party being more right leaning, more left leaning, because their aggregate collective position, it's easier to assign them into that category. But when you're talking about an actual individual, it becomes harder, right? And I think many of us can probably relate to that feeling as well, where economically you might be more right leaning, but socially you might be left leaning, or the other way around, right? And I think for me, some of these policies may reflect this sort of complexity to Andy Burnham, which is something I've always suspected, right? So I would probably have suspected he may be quite hawkish around defending the UK's borders, about UK's ability to defend itself from a military perspective, support its allies from a military perspective, basically think about restricting some spending in some areas in order to support that, while still having his own socialist views around certain things, around housing, for example, and potentially taxes based on some of the things he's mentioned already around a land tax. So again, I think he's a complicated and complex individual, as we all are. And I think ultimately what we're observing so far reflects that individual complexity.
We don't yet know exactly how this crackdown will work. It's notable that at the very same time he's discussing this, Burnham is also announcing an extra £8.4 billion in investment for Britain's nuclear deterrent. Promising to cut welfare by increasing defence spending certainly isn't the sort of move that those on the left of Labour were likely wanting him to make. On economic policy, there have been rumours since he took office that Burnham may be plotting to radically change how the tax system works. There have been rumours that he may be considering introducing changes to the way that council tax and stamp duty works, with some outlets suggesting that he may introduce a 0.48% annual charge on the value of a property.
Yeah, and I think for me, this is a good example of this, right? Where at the moment, we really don't know what he's going to do about taxes. Like there's just been all these rumors, and the most consistent rumor and most persistent rumor is that he's thinking about some sort of land tax. And my own view is, again, if it's based on a valuation, and that valuation is linked to market or potential or hypothetical market value, because it will be a hypothetical value on the basis that you're not selling your home to establish the value, then clearly one could view this as a transfer of wealth from the south to the north, because typically houses in the south will have more value than houses in the north. And one may argue equally that that's a fair approach based on so far the perceived concentration of investment in the south, right? So the UK has always been perceived as prioritizing the south, predominantly London. And that is part of the reason why Andy Burnham has symbolically created the number 10 of the north, right? So again, this would be consistent with his own, I don't want to say personal agenda, but ultimately there will be some personal aspects as a leader as to what you're trying to achieve, which obviously he's been mandated to do by virtue of the fact he's managed to get himself into the leadership position as as Labour leader and Prime Minister, right? So he will feel a personal conviction and mandate to do some of the personal things he wants to achieve. And my suspicion is this would be a personal objective of his, to basically see a more diverse economy with respect from the fact that you want to see, a healthy economy up in the north, as well as an economy growing in the south.
Something simpler, like an increase in the tax-free personal allowance, the threshold of which has been frozen since 2021. However, already Burnham has started to pour cold water on these ideas. Downing Street explicitly stated that rumours about council tax and stamp duty were not true and pure speculation. On the tax-free allowance, Burnham suggested that he isn't making an immediate commitment.
Yeah, and when politicians say things like this, where they have no plans, there's no immediate commitments, whilst at the same time not signaling anything, it usually suggests to me they don't really know what they're going to do, and they're still trying to figure it out. And if anything, I wouldn't expect any great radical changes or reforms, right? Because normally they would say we have ambitious plans, even if they don't share those plans. So for me, my suspicion is they don't really know what they're going to do with respect to tax and how they're going to approach it. But they're going to have to figure it out. That is for sure. So as I say, it'll be a case of watching this space and seeing what happens.
It's out that it could be reviewed at the budget. Again, this demonstrates that perhaps Burnham isn't going to be as radical as some of those on the left may have thought.
I would be inclined to agree with that, certainly from a tax perspective, right? I don't think he's going to be that radical in this space, right? I think he may be radical in some other areas, and obviously, declaring he's going to end homelessness is quite a radical thing to announce, I would argue. But when it comes to tax, I think he's going to tread very, very carefully. Would be my instinct. I don't know that for a fact, obviously, but that would be my feeling.
The big changes, reviewing the way that council tax and stamp duty work, and potentially bringing in the type of land value tax, which he had previously spoken out in favour of, Burnham has been clear that they're not being considered. It's only the smaller, more incremental changes that he appears willing to legislate. So there are a number of ways that we can see that Andy Burnham is moving, potentially to the right. However, Burnham is something of a complex political figure. He can't simply be characterised by someone moving Labour to the right, because in many other ways, he's also pivoted to the left.
Yeah, and I agree. He is complex, and I don't think at this stage it's fair to characterize him as moving Labour further to the right, right? Like either they are where they are, or if anything, he's moving them slightly towards the center. Like, it's just interesting that we're talking about the left, but actually Labour are so far right now. I think any movement towards the left only takes them back to their original center, right? I don't think Labour would ever traditionally have viewed themselves as a left-leaning party. They would have always argued, if anything, they were a center position party, right? So for me, it's interesting that we're using the word left, but it's just relative to where Labour are now, and by moving them more away from the right, I would actually argue they're now actually moving back to their traditional centre of politics.
Already, Burnham has committed more than £10 billion in extra government spending. He's outlined new cost of living support, he's capped bus fares, and he's already earmarked an extra £340 million of government support over the next 3 years to help reduce rough sleeping. On top of this, he's established Number 10 North, a symbolic and practical way of trying to move power out of Westminster and make the country fairer to those living in the regions. Burnham has claimed that this will have 3 purposes: to increase public control of essential utilities such as water, energy, and housing, to reindustrialise swathes of the country, and to regenerate towns, prioritising places that have been left behind.
Yeah, and what I would say about that is that I think this signals towards his view around trying to deal with the cost of living, right? So if you're trying to grow an economy up in the north, potentially you're thinking about a transfer of wealth from the south to the north in terms of firstly investment, as well as a tax system that basically means people in the south with higher valued homes will be contributing to it more so than those up in the north. And you are looking at cutting or capping bus fare increases, things like this. To me, it means that the cost of living agenda is a higher priority, right? It's something he is thinking about and trying to deal with. But what I would always say is that my hope is that the tax system is also mirroring this agenda, i.e. the discussion the presenter made about increasing the personal tax allowance in line with inflation, for example, would be a good way of addressing that agenda and making sure that taxes on workers are not increasing is a good way of addressing that agenda, because all of those things contribute to the cost of living as well, right? So this is why I think it's quite complex in terms of what is going on in Andy Burnham's mind, because I think he's somebody who is kind of like a Britain First type politician, whereby I can still see him being quite tough on immigration, for example. I can see him being quite tough with respect to border enforcement, military capability, and also being somebody that says, okay, for those that are British citizens in this country, I want to help equalize things. I want to make things fairer, right? So to me, I can kind of start seeing a common thread in terms of the kind of person Andy Burnham is and what he may be trying to achieve. But obviously, I'm just speculating on all these different things, right? I don't really know him. But at the moment, I can kind of see a common thread with all the different things I'm hearing, despite the fact that apparently some of it is right leaning and apparently some of it's left leaning, right? I can still see a coherent picture forming, actually.
These things point to a Prime Minister that is trying to be more radical and more amenable to parts of the left of the Labour Party. Perhaps then Burnham is doing what a lot of Prime Ministers have realised they have to do when they take office. He's not governing in a purely ideological way, but in a more pragmatic one, and one that takes into account the views of more than one faction of the party.
Okay, so I think we're going to leave it there. And what I would say is that, again, it will be very interesting to see what Labour looks like, under Andy Burnham. I think the stakes are relatively high because, again, if Andy Burnham misjudges anything, quite significantly, I think it will open up the door for the Conservatives and Reform, more so than it will give opportunities to the left, I think, and Zach Polanski's party, the Green Party, and the Liberal Democrats. But again, I think from my own perspective, nothing I'm hearing about Andy Burnham or observing and what's been speculated on is particularly surprising to me, right? I think he wants to bring the Labour Party together, and that does mean making some concessions between those that are sitting on the right and those that are sitting on the left. I think he is somebody that has a very nationalistic view around how to prioritize certain things. So I do think he kind of is a soft Britain first type of politician. And I think many politicians are like this. But what I mean by this is that, he will try to do things that will help ordinary British citizens. And part of that, I think, is that he believes that national security is an important part of that, right? Whilst many on the left may argue, well, actually, military and the defense seems to have this endless budget. And actually, some of that should go towards investment, for example. That would be the better thing to do for the country rather than prioritizing defense, for example. So I think for me, that is where there may be some conflict, I think, between someone like Andy Burnham and those that remain on the left, whereby in their view, this constant need to spend on military and the impact that's going to have relative to the impact of, say, uplifting those that need support, investing in the welfare state, investing in infrastructure, that's where the conflict is going to lie ultimately. And I think my own view would be investing in infrastructure would be more beneficial overall than investing in defense, I would argue. So that would be my own personal position. So I think both need attention, but I think the bigger priority is local infrastructure and investment. And on the top of that, what I would hope to see, which is where I don't know where Andy Burnham is leaning, is tax policies that align with what I'm perceiving to be his agenda to, keep the cost of living reasonable, right? And not see any significant increases in that space. And I think for me, if that is the agenda of his Labour government, then I think, my position would be he needs to look at a tax system that is genuinely progressive, that considers what, taxing the ultra wealthy, and then gives him the ability then to achieve his military defense objectives in terms of giving them the money they need, whilst at the same time, being able to deliver on some of the new initiatives and promises he's made with respect to welfare welfare and social benefits, i.e., creating shelter for those that are sleeping rough, being able to fund this cap on bus fares, for example, and these £10 billion or so that has been earmarked, as the presenter outlined, for obviously social initiatives. So that would be my hope ultimately, that he has a tax system that enables him to fund whatever vision he has for the UK economy. So on that note, we'll leave it there. Hopefully you found it useful. As I said, I'll leave a link to the original video so you can check it out for yourself. But until next time, take care. Peace.